Captain Sarah Chun adjusted her helmet one final time as she climbed into the cockpit of her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the runway at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Around her, the familiar sounds of military aviation filled the air, the whine of jet engines, the chatter of ground crews, and the distant rumble of transport aircraft taking off for supply runs. Sarah had been in country for 8 months now, flying combat air patrol missions over the volatile regions where enemy fighters have been increasingly active. At 28 years old, she was one of only a handful of female fighter pilots in her squadron, but she had earned her place through skill, determination, and an almost supernatural ability to read aerial combat situations. The briefing that morning had been routine. Intelligence suggested light enemy activity in the sector she would be patrolling. Her mission was straightforward: maintain air superiority over a convoy of humanitarian supplies heading to a remote village that had been cut off by recent fighting. The convoy carried medical supplies, food, and water purification equipment desperately needed by civilian populations caught in the crossfire of ongoing conflicts. As Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist, her crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, appeared at the side of her aircraft. Rodriguez had been working on fighter jets for 15 years and had developed an almost paternal protective instinct toward the pilots he served. He climbed up the ladder to speak with Sarah directly. "Everything looks good, Captain," Rodriguez said, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the flight line. "Weapon systems are fully operational, fuel is topped off, and I personally checked every system twice. You got a full load of AIM, 120 AMRAAM missiles, and AM-9 Sidewinders. More than enough for anything you might encounter out there." Sarah nodded her appreciation. Rodriguez always went above and beyond to ensure his aircraft were in perfect condition. His attention to detail had saved more than one pilot's life over the years. She knew that when Rodriguez signed off on an aircraft, it was as close to perfect as human hands could make it. "Thanks, Chief," Sarah replied, giving him a thumbs up. "I'll bring her back in one piece." Rodriguez smiled and patted the side of the aircraft affectionately. "You always do, Captain. You always do." As Sarah continued her checklist, she thought about the path that had led her to this moment. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she had dreamed of flying since childhood. Her father had been a commercial airline pilot, and some of her earliest memories were of sitting in airplane cockpits, fascinated by the complexity of the instruments and controls. When she was 12, her father had taken her to an air show where she watched the Air Force Thunderbirds perform their precision flying demonstration. That day, she knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to be a fighter pilot. The journey had not been easy. Flight training was among the most demanding programs in the military. The physical requirements were punishing, the academic coursework was intense, and the psychological pressure was constant. Many of her classmates had washed out along the way, unable to handle the stress or meet the exacting standards required of military aviators. Sarah had persevered through sheer determination and an unwavering belief in her abilities. After completing flight training, she had been assigned to her current squadron and deployed to Afghanistan. The transition from training to combat operations had been challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. Training scenarios, no matter how realistic, could never fully prepare a pilot for the life and death decisions required in actual combat. The weight of responsibility was immense, not just for her own safety, but for the lives of the ground forces and civilians who depended on air support for their survival. Over the months of her deployment, Sarah had proven herself repeatedly. She had flown escort missions for transport aircraft, provided close air support for ground troops under fire, and intercepted suspicious aircraft attempting to enter restricted airspace. Her squadron commander, Colonel Martinez, had noted in her evaluations that she possessed a rare combination of technical skill and tactical awareness that made her one of the most effective pilots under his command. As Sarah completed her pre-flight checks, she received clearance from the control tower to taxi to the runway. The F-16 responded smoothly to her inputs as she guided it along the taxiway, past rows of other military aircraft. Helicopters sat ready for medical evacuation missions. Transport planes were being loaded with supplies, and other fighter jets were undergoing maintenance between flights. The base was a constant hive of activity, operating around the clock to support military operations across the region. Reaching the runway, Sarah received final clearance for takeoff. She pushed the throttle forward, feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as the powerful engine drove her aircraft down the runway. The sensation of liftoff never got old. That moment when the aircraft separated from the earth and entered its natural element in the sky. As the ground fell away beneath her, Sarah felt the familiar sense of freedom and purpose that came with being airborne. Climbing to her assigned altitude, Sarah established radio contact with the ground controller who would coordinate her mission. The controller, call sign Blackjack, was located in a heavily fortified command center several miles from the airbase. Through a sophisticated network of radar installations and communication equipment, Blackjack could track aircraft and coordinate air operations across hundreds of square miles of territory. Raptor 17, this is Blackjack, came the voice through her headset. We have you on scope, climbing through 15,000 feet. Your patrol sector is designated Alpha 7. The convoy you're escorting is currently moving through Checkpoint Bravo and should reach the patrol area in approximately 20 minutes. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and adjusted her heading toward the designated patrol area. The landscape below was a mixture of rugged mountains and desert terrain, dotted with small villages and the occasional larger town. Roads were few and often in poor condition, making ground transportation dangerous and difficult. This was why air support was so crucial for humanitarian operations in the region. As she flew toward her patrol area, Sarah monitored the radio frequencies used by the convoy she was protecting. The convoy commander, an Army captain named Morrison, was conducting regular radio checks with his vehicle drivers and providing updates on their progress. From his transmissions, Sarah could tell that Morrison was experienced and professional, the kind of officer who took the safety of his personnel seriously. All stations, this is Convoy 6, Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. We're approaching the valley entrance now. Raptor 17, do you have eyes on our position? Sarah looked down and spotted the small cluster of vehicles moving along the dusty road below. The convoy consisted of 6 trucks carrying supplies, 2 armored vehicles for protection, and a command vehicle. They appeared to be moving at a steady pace, maintaining proper spacing between vehicles to minimize the impact of any potential attack. Convoy 6, this is Raptor 17, Sarah responded. I have visual contact with your position. I'll be maintaining overwatch as you proceed through the valley. Current area appears clear of hostile activity. The valley they were entering was particularly dangerous because it provided numerous hiding places for enemy fighters. The rocky terrain and scattered vegetation offered concealment for those who might want to ambush passing convoys. Intelligence reports had indicated increased enemy activity in the area over the past several weeks, though no specific threats had been identified for this particular mission. As Sarah maintained her patrol pattern above the convoy, she continuously scanned the area with both her naked eye and the sophisticated sensor systems built into her aircraft. The F-16's radar could detect other aircraft at considerable distances, while infrared sensors could identify heat signatures on the ground that might indicate enemy positions. So far, everything appeared normal. The convoy made steady progress through the valley, stopping occasionally at predetermined checkpoints to conduct security sweeps and communicate with higher command. These stops were necessary, but made Sarah somewhat nervous, as stationary targets were always more vulnerable to attack than moving ones. Each time the convoy stopped, she increased her vigilance, watching for any signs of hostile activity in the surrounding terrain. About halfway through the valley, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Her radar was showing what appeared to be aircraft contacts at the extreme edge of its range, but the signatures were intermittent and unclear. At first, she thought it might be false returns caused by atmospheric conditions or ground interference, both of which were common in the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan. However, as she continued to monitor the contacts, they began to appear more consistent and seemed to be moving in her general direction. Sarah immediately reported the potential contacts to Blackjack, who began coordinating with other radar installations in the area to get a clearer picture of what might be approaching. Blackjack, this is Raptor 17, Sarah transmitted. I'm seeing intermittent radar contacts bearing 085, range approximately 60 miles, and closing. Contact appear to be multiple aircraft, but I cannot get a clear count or identification at this time. There was a brief pause before Blackjack responded, and Sarah could hear increased activity in the background of the transmission. Other voices were speaking rapidly, and she could hear the sounds of personnel moving quickly around the command center. Raptor 17, Blackjack. We're showing similar contacts on our long-range surveillance radar. Stand by while we attempt identification and coordinate additional support aircraft to your position. The next few minutes felt like hours as Sarah waited for more information while maintaining her protective orbit around the convoy below. The unknown aircraft contacts continued to approach, and Sarah began making mental preparations for the possibility of air-to-air combat. She reviewed the engagement procedures she had trained on countless times, checked the status of her weapon systems, and positioned her aircraft for optimal tactical advantage. Suddenly, her radar warning receiver began emitting a distinctive tone that made her blood run cold. The sound indicated that she was being targeted by enemy radar systems, specifically the type used by hostile fighter aircraft to guide their weapons. The intermittent contacts she had been tracking were now clearly identified as enemy fighters, and they were preparing to engage. Blackjack Raptor 17. Sarah called urgently into her radio. I'm being painted by hostile fire control radar. Multiple contacts now showing clearly on scope, bearing 082, range 40 miles, and closing fast. The response from Blackjack was immediate and urgent. Raptor 17, you are cleared to engage hostile aircraft. Additional support is being scrambled to your location, but they are at least 15 minutes out. Convoy 6 has been notified and is seeking cover. Sarah felt her training take over as her mind shifted into combat mode. The months of preparation, the hundreds of hours of flight training, and the countless simulations had all led to this moment. She was about to face enemy fighters in actual air-to-air combat, and the lives of the convoy personnel below depended on her ability to prevail. Banking her aircraft toward the approaching threats, Sarah began climbing to gain altitude advantage. Height was crucial in air combat, as it provided both tactical advantage and energy that could be converted to speed when needed. As she climbed, she armed her missile systems and began the process of identifying and prioritizing targets. Her radar was now showing 7 distinct aircraft contacts approaching in a loose formation. Based on their flight characteristics and radar signatures, they appear to be a mix of older Soviet-built fighters that were commonly used by hostile forces in the region. These aircraft were less technologically advanced than her F-16, but they were still dangerous, especially in large numbers. The lead enemy aircraft was now within range of Sarah's longest-range missiles. According to her tactical doctrine, she should engage at maximum range to take advantage of her superior weapon systems. However, she also knew that once she fired her first missile, the element of surprise would be lost, and the enemy fighters would begin evasive maneuvers and return fire. Sarah selected her first target, the lead aircraft in the enemy formation, and achieved missile lock. The distinctive tone in her headset indicated that her AM-120 AMRAAM missile had acquired the target and was ready to launch. She took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and squeezed the trigger. The missile leaped from its mounting point under her aircraft with a brilliant flash of light and a trail of white smoke. Sarah immediately began maneuvering to avoid any return fire while tracking the progress of her missile towards target. The AMRAAM was one of the most advanced air-to-air missiles in the world, capable of finding and destroying enemy aircraft at ranges of over 60 miles. As her first missile streaked toward its target, Sarah was already selecting her second enemy aircraft and preparing for what she knew would be the fight of her life. 7 enemy fighters against 1 F-16 was not favorable odds by any calculation, but she had advantages in training, technology, and determination that might be enough to even the scales. The next 2 minutes would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of the convoy she was sworn to protect. Sarah's first missile found its mark with devastating precision. The lead enemy aircraft simply disappeared from her radar screen in a brief flash that she caught in her peripheral vision. 6 contacts remained, and they were now fully aware of her presence and capabilities. The element of surprise was gone, but Sarah had reduced the odd from 7-1 to 6-1. Every small advantage would matter in the fight that was about to unfold. The enemy formation immediately began to scatter, abandoning their loose group formation for individual attack patterns. Sarah recognized the tactic. They were trying to force her to defend against multiple threats from different directions simultaneously, making it impossible for her to focus on any single target long enough to achieve an effective attack. It was a sound strategy when facing a superior aircraft with limited numbers. Sarah's tactical training kicked in as she evaluated the rapidly changing situation. She had 6 enemy fighters positioned across roughly 90 degrees of airspace around her, with altitudes ranging from slightly below her position to several thousand feet above. 3 of the aircraft appeared to be moving to flank her from the east, while the remaining 3 were attempting to gain position for a head-on attack. Her second missile launch targeted the closest of the eastern group, an aircraft that was attempting to climb above her for an altitude advantage. The AM-120 AMRAAM left her aircraft with the same brilliant flash and smoke trail as the first, but this time the enemy pilot was ready. Sarah watched as the targeted aircraft immediately dove toward the ground, deploying chaff and flares in an attempt to confuse the incoming missile. The tactic partially worked. The missile lost its lock momentarily as it sorted through the electronic countermeasures, but the AMRAAM's sophisticated guidance system quickly reacquired the target. The enemy pilot's dive had gained him speed, but cost him altitude, and he was running out of room to maneuver. The missile struck the aircraft just as the pilot was beginning to pull out of his dive, creating another brief fireball that quickly faded against the desert landscape below. 5 enemy fighters remained, and they were now close enough to begin firing their own missiles. Sarah's radar warning receiver erupted in a symphony of threatening tones as multiple enemy aircraft achieved targeting locks on her position. Training and instinct took over as she began a series of violent evasive maneuvers designed to break the enemy targeting solutions. The first enemy missile passed close enough to her aircraft that she could see it streak past her canopy. The proximity was both terrifying and encouraging. Terrifying because of how close she had come to being hit, but encouraging because it meant the enemy missiles were not as sophisticated as her own and could be defeated through proper maneuvering. Sarah rolled her aircraft inverted and pulled hard toward the ground, using the Earth's surface to mask her position from some of the enemy radar systems. The maneuver was risky at her current altitude, but it successfully broke the lock of at least 2 enemy fighters. As she leveled out barely 1,000 feet above the rocky terrain, she spotted the convoy below, still moving toward their destination, but now with their vehicles spread out and seeking what cover they could find. Climbing back toward a more tactically advantageous altitude, Sarah selected her third target. This aircraft was attempting to position itself behind her for what would be a devastating shot if successful. Fighter pilots called this position the 6 o'clock, and it was one of the most dangerous positions to allow an enemy to achieve. Sarah needed to deal with this threat immediately before it could achieve an effective firing position. Banking hard to the right, Sarah reversed direction and pointed her aircraft directly at the threatening fighter. This head-on approach was risky because it also gave the enemy pilot a shot at her, but it was the quickest way to deny him the advantageous position he was seeking. The two aircraft rushed toward each other at a combined speed of over 1,000 miles per hour, both pilots trying to achieve missile lock before the other. Sarah's superior technology gave her the edge. Her missile lock tone sounded first, and she immediately fired her third AMRAAM. At the same instant, she saw the flash of a missile launch from the enemy aircraft. Both missiles were now in the air, racing toward their respective targets across the rapidly shrinking distance between the two fighters. Combat aviation required split-second decision-making and absolute confidence in one's abilities. Sarah didn't waste time watching her missiles progress toward its target. Instead, she immediately began defensive maneuvers against the incoming enemy missile while simultaneously looking for her next target among the 4 remaining hostile aircraft. Her defensive maneuvers consisted of a rapid series of direction changes combined with the deployment of her own chaff and flares. The chaff consisted of thousands of tiny metallic strips designed to confuse enemy radar systems, while the flares were intensely hot-burning devices intended to distract heat-seeking missiles. Both countermeasures had to be deployed at precisely the right moment to be effective. The enemy missile passed within 100 yards of her aircraft before losing lock and spiraling harmlessly toward the ground. Her own missile was more successful, finding its target and removing the 4th enemy fighter from the engagement. 4 hostiles remained, but Sarah was now running low on long-range missiles and would soon have to close to shorter ranges where the enemy's numerical advantage would become more significant. Sarah's tactical situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The 4 remaining enemy fighters had learned from watching their comrades get shot down and were now employing more sophisticated tactics. Instead of attacking individually, they were coordinating their approaches to force Sarah into defensive positions where she couldn't effectively return fire. One group of 2 fighters was approaching from her left, while the other pair was coming from her right. The timing of their approaches was calculated to force Sarah to defend against one group, while leaving herself vulnerable to the other. It was a classic pincer movement, and Sarah realized she needed to do something unexpected to avoid being trapped. Instead of turning to defend against either group, Sarah pointed her nose directly down toward the ground and dove at maximum speed. The maneuver was dangerous and counterintuitive, but it forced the enemy fighters to adjust their attack angles and gave Sarah a few precious seconds to reassess the situation. More importantly, it put her closer to the convoy, which was now taking defensive positions behind whatever cover they could find. At low altitude, Sarah had fewer options for maneuvering, but she also forced the enemy fighters to come down to her level if they wanted to continue the engagement. Fighter aircraft performed differently at various altitudes, and Sarah was betting that her F-16 would have advantages over the older enemy fighters in the thick air near the ground. Her bet paid off. As the enemy fighters followed her down, their performance degraded more than hers did. The superior engineering of her aircraft gave her better maneuverability and acceleration at low altitude, allowing her to begin turning the tables on her attackers. She selected the closest of the 4 remaining fighters and switched to her shorter-range AM-9 Sidewinder missiles. The Sidewinder was a heat-seeking missile that was deadly at close range. Unlike the radar-guided AMRAAM missiles she had been using for longer-range shots, the Sidewinder locked onto the heat signature of enemy aircraft engines. This made it much more difficult for the enemy to defeat using electronic countermeasures, but it also required Sarah to get much closer to her targets. Sarah maneuvered behind one of the enemy fighters and heard the distinctive growling tone that indicated her Sidewinder had achieved a heat lock. The enemy pilot was apparently unaware of her position, concentrating instead on trying to target the convoy below. Sarah fired the missile and watched as it curved through the air toward the enemy aircraft's engines. The Sidewinder struck with devastating effect, and the enemy fighter disintegrated in a ball of flame. 3 hostile aircraft remained, but they were now spread across the sky and no longer coordinating their attacks effectively. Sarah had managed to disrupt their tactical formation and could now engage them individually rather than fighting all of them simultaneously. Banking toward the next closest enemy fighter, Sarah prepared to fire another Sidewinder. This pilot was more alert and saw her approaching. A dangerous aerial dance began as both aircraft maneuvered for advantage, each trying to get behind the other for a killing shot. They twisted and turned through the sky in a display of aerial combat that would have been spectacular to watch from a safe distance. Sarah's superior training began to show as she gradually gained advantage in the maneuvering fight. Her understanding of aircraft performance and energy management allowed her to position her F-16 for an optimal shot. When the opportunity presented itself, she fired her sixth missile of the engagement and watched as another enemy fighter was eliminated from the fight. 2 hostile aircraft remained, and Sarah was beginning to feel the physical effects of the intense aerial combat. The high-G maneuvers required to avoid enemy missiles and position for her own shots were exhausting, and she'd been fighting at maximum intensity for what felt like hours, but had actually been only minutes. Her flight suit's anti-G system was working to keep blood flowing to her brain, but the sustained physical stress was cumulative. The 2 remaining enemy pilots seemed to recognize that their numerical advantage was rapidly disappearing. Instead of continuing to engage Sarah directly, they began maneuvering toward the convoy below. Sarah realized with growing alarm that they intended to attack the ground vehicles if they couldn't defeat her in air-to-air combat. This changed the tactical situation completely. Sarah could no longer focus solely on aerial combat. She now had to position herself to protect the convoy from attack. The enemy fighters were older aircraft, but they still carried air-to-ground weapons that could devastate the thin-skinned vehicles below. Captain Morrison and his personnel would have no defense against an aerial attack except for Sarah's protection. Sarah dove toward the first enemy fighter that was lining up for an attack run on the convoy. The pilot saw her coming and turned to engage her directly rather than continue his attack on the ground vehicles. This was exactly what Sarah wanted, to keep the enemy fighters focused on her rather than the defenseless convoy. The aerial battle that followed was perhaps the most intense of Sarah's life. Fighting at low altitude with limited room for maneuvering, she engaged in a close-range dogfight that tested every aspect of her flying skills. The enemy pilot was skilled and determined, and his aircraft, while older, was still a formidable opponent in the hands of someone who knew how to fly it. After several minutes of maneuvering, Sarah managed to position herself for another Sidewinder shot. The missile found its target, reducing the enemy force to a single remaining fighter. However, while she had been engaged with the first aircraft, the second enemy fighter had begun its attack run on the convoy. Sarah could see the enemy aircraft diving toward the line of vehicles below. Captain Morrison and his personnel were doing their best to take cover, but they were essentially helpless against an air attack. Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds to intercept the attacking aircraft before it could deliver its weapons against the convoy. Banking hard toward the attacking fighter, Sarah pushed her aircraft to its limits. The F-16 responded magnificently, but physics imposed limitations that even the best aircraft couldn't overcome. Sarah wasn't going to be able to get into position for a missile shot before the enemy aircraft reached the convoy. Desperation drove Sarah to attempt something that went against all her training. Instead of trying to achieve a proper missile lock, she fired her last Sidewinder at maximum range with only a marginal heat signature. It was a low-percentage shot that would normally be considered a waste of ammunition, but she had no other options available. The missile streaked across the sky toward the attacking aircraft, which was now only seconds away from releasing its weapons against the convoy. Sarah watched with a mixture of hope and dread as her last missile chased the enemy fighter through its attack dive. If this shot missed, there would be nothing she could do to prevent the attack on Morrison's vehicles. The Sidewinder missile streaked through the air on what appeared to be an impossible intercept course. Sarah held her breath as she watched the missile's exhaust trail curve through the sky, chasing the enemy fighter that was now less than 3 seconds from releasing its weapons on the convoy below. The physics of the engagement seemed to work against her. The range was too great, the angle was too difficult, and the timing was too tight. But sometimes in combat, impossible things happen through a combination of skill, determination, and pure chance. The enemy pilot, focused entirely on his attack run against the ground targets, failed to notice the approaching missile until it was too late to take effective countermeasures. The Sidewinder's infrared seeker locked onto the hot exhaust of the enemy aircraft's engine and guided itself to a direct hit just as the pilot was beginning to release his weapons. The enemy fighter disintegrated in a massive explosion that lit up the valley floor. Debris scattered across the landscape, but the weapons that had been intended for the convoy fell harmlessly into empty terrain. Sarah had successfully eliminated all 7 enemy fighters, but the victory had come at a cost that was only now becoming apparent. During the intense aerial combat, Sarah had expended all of her air-to-air missiles. Her fuel supply, while not critical, was lower than she would have preferred for a safe return to base. More concerning was the condition of her aircraft itself. The extreme maneuvering required during the dogfights had stressed the F-16 systems to their limits, and several warning lights on her instrument panel indicated that not everything was functioning within normal parameters. Her radar warning receiver had been damaged during one of the high-G maneuvers, leaving her partially blind to potential future threats. The heads-up display that projected critical flight information onto her windscreen was flickering intermittently. Most seriously, her aircraft's hydraulic system was showing pressure fluctuations that could indicate a developing problem with her flight controls. Despite these issues, Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she established radio contact with the convoy below. Captain Morrison's voice came through her headset with obvious relief and gratitude. Raptor 17, this is Convoy 6. That was the most incredible display of flying I've ever witnessed. You just saved our lives down here. All personnel are accounted for, and we're continuing mission. I don't know how to thank you. Sarah smiled inside her helmet as she began a slow orbit around the convoy's position. Convoy 6, Raptor 17. Just doing my job, Captain. Are you able to continue to your destination, or do you need to return to base? We're continuing mission, Morrison replied. The supplies we're carrying are desperately needed, and we're only about 20 minutes out from the delivery point. Can you stay with us until we complete the drop-off? Sarah quickly calculated her fuel consumption and flight time back to base. With the aircraft damage and the uncertainty about her hydraulic system, she would prefer to return to base as soon as possible for a thorough inspection. However, the convoy was vulnerable without air cover, and intelligence had indicated that enemy forces were still active in the area. Convoy 6, I can stay with you until delivery completion, Sarah confirmed. After that, I'll need to return to base for fuel and maintenance. As the convoy resumed its movement toward the destination village, Sarah maintained her protective orbit overhead while simultaneously running diagnostics on her aircraft systems. The damage assessment was concerning, but not immediately life-threatening. The hydraulic pressure fluctuations seemed to be stabilizing, though she would need to be careful about excessive maneuvering on her return flight. Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission from Blackjack Control. Raptor 17, this is Blackjack. We monitored the entire engagement and confirm 7 enemy aircraft destroyed. Outstanding work out there. Be advised that additional friendly aircraft are being scrambled to provide backup coverage for your return flight. The acknowledgement from ground control was gratifying, but Sarah was already focused on her next challenge, ensuring the safe delivery of the humanitarian supplies and then getting her damaged aircraft back to base. Combat flying required constant attention to changing priorities, and the mission wasn't complete until everyone was safely on the ground. As they approached the destination village, Sarah could see why the supply delivery was so critical. The settlement was located in a remote valley that had been cut off from normal supply routes by recent fighting. From her aerial perspective, she could see that many of the buildings showed signs of damage from artillery or mortar attacks. The local population clearly needed the medical supplies, food, and water purification equipment that Morrison's convoy was bringing. The village had prepared a landing zone for the supply drop in a cleared area near the center of town. Sarah could see people gathering around the perimeter, waiting for the arrival of the much-needed supplies. Children and adults alike looked up at her aircraft as she circled overhead, some waving in recognition of the protection she was providing for their lifeline to the outside world. Captain Morrison conducted the supply delivery with military precision. His vehicles formed a defensive perimeter around the landing zone, while personnel quickly unloaded the critical supplies. Village leaders coordinated with Morrison's team to ensure that the most urgent medical supplies were distributed first, followed by food and water purification equipment. The efficiency of the operation impressed Sarah as she watched from above. Within 30 minutes, the convoy had completely unloaded their cargo and was preparing to depart. The grateful villagers gathered around Morrison and his personnel, shaking hands and expressing their thanks in a mixture of English and local languages. The scene below reminded Sarah of why she had chosen to serve in the military, to make a difference in the lives of people who needed protection and assistance. As the convoy prepared to depart the village, Sarah received another radio call from Blackjack Control. Raptor 17, this is Blackjack. We have 2 additional F-16s airborne and heading to your location to escort you back to base. Call sign Raptor 23 and 24, estimated time to your position 12 minutes. The prospect of having backup aircraft for her return flight was reassuring, especially given her aircraft's damaged condition. While the hydraulic system seemed to be functioning adequately, Sarah didn't want to take any unnecessary risks with a potentially unstable aircraft. Having other pilots nearby would provide additional options if her situation deteriorated during the flight home. Blackjack, Raptor 17 copies. I'll coordinate with the escort flight for return to base once Convoy 6 is clear of the area. The convoy began its return journey, following a different route than they had used for the inbound trip. This was standard security procedure, designed to prevent enemy forces from predicting their movements and setting up ambushes. Sarah continued her protective orbit as the vehicles wound their way through the mountain passes toward the main road that would take them back to friendly territory. About 15 minutes into the return journey, Sarah spotted 2 aircraft approaching from the east. Her damaged radar warning receiver gave inconsistent readings, but the aircraft were approaching from the direction of her home base and were maintaining the flight profile she would expect from friendly fighters. She attempted to establish radio contact to confirm their identity. Aircraft approaching from the east, this is Raptor 17. Please identify yourselves. The response came immediately and brought welcome relief. Raptor 17, this is Raptor 23 with 24 in formation. We're your escort flight back to base. Good to see you're still airborne after that engagement. Sarah recognized the voice of Captain Jake Sullivan, one of her squadron mates. Sullivan was an experienced pilot who had been deployed to Afghanistan for over a year. Having him and his wingman as escort would make her return flight much safer and more comfortable. Raptor 2317. Very glad to see you guys. Be advised my aircraft has some damage and I'll need to keep maneuvering to a minimum on the way home. Copy that, 17. We'll maintain loose formation and keep watch for any additional threats. How's your fuel situation? Sarah checked her fuel gauge and calculated her remaining flight time. Fuel is adequate for return to base with normal reserves. The main concern is hydraulic system fluctuations that could affect control authority. Understood. We'll stay close and monitor your aircraft visually for any signs of problems. The 3 aircraft formation settled into a comfortable cruise back toward Bagram Air Base. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she realized the immediate crisis was over. The convoy was safely on its way back to friendly territory. The enemy fighters had been eliminated, and she had backup support for her return flight. For the first time in what felt like hours, she had a few minutes to reflect on what had just happened. 7 enemy fighters destroyed in a single engagement was an extraordinary achievement by any measure. Most fighter pilots would go through entire careers without encountering aerial combat, much less achieving multiple kills in a single mission. Sarah understood that she had just participated in one of the most significant air-to-air engagements in recent military history. More importantly, from her perspective, the humanitarian mission had been successful. The supplies had been delivered to people who desperately needed them, and Morrison's convoy was returning safely to base. That outcome was worth far more to Sarah than any personal recognition she might receive for her combat performance. As they flew toward home, Captain Sullivan provided updates on the tactical situation in their area. Raptor 17, be advised that intelligence is showing increased enemy activity throughout the region following today's engagement. It appears your success this morning has prompted some significant reactions from hostile forces. What kind of reactions? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Multiple reports of enemy aircraft being moved into the area, along with increased surface-to-air missile activity. Command is treating this as a potential escalation in the overall conflict level. Sarah absorbed this information with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was proud that her successful defense of the convoy had demonstrated the effectiveness of coalition air power. On the other hand, she realized that her actions might have provoked a stronger enemy response that could put other coalition personnel at risk. Any immediate threats to our return flight? She asked. Nothing specific, but we're maintaining heightened alert status. 2 additional fighter patrols have been scrambled to cover other potential approach routes to the base. The rest of the flight passed without incident, though Sarah remained vigilant for any signs of enemy activity. Her aircraft continued to show signs of stress from the morning's combat, with occasional warning lights and some sluggishness in the controls, but nothing that prevented safe flight operations. As Bagram Air Base came into view on the horizon, Sarah felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. The mission had been successful by any measure, but, more importantly, everyone was coming home alive. In military aviation, that was always the most important measure of success. The control tower cleared the 3 aircraft for landing, with Sarah given priority due to her aircraft's damaged condition. As she lined up on final approach, she could see fire trucks and ambulances standing by as a precaution. The sight reminded her once again of the inherent risks of military flying and how fortunate she had been to survive the morning's engagement. Sarah's F-16 touched down on the runway at Bagram Air Base with a slightly harder impact than usual, a testament to the hydraulic system issues that have been plaguing the aircraft since the aerial engagement. The damaged controls felt sluggish in her hands, requiring more input than normal to maintain proper alignment during the landing roll. Despite these challenges, the aircraft responded well enough to allow a safe landing, and Sarah felt a wave of relief as she brought the fighter to a stop on the taxiway. Ground crews were waiting for her aircraft before she had even shut down the engines. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was among the first to reach her position, his experienced eyes already scanning the aircraft for visible signs of damage. As Sarah completed her post-flight shutdown procedures, she could hear Rodriguez coordinating with other maintenance personnel over the radio chatter of the ground frequency. "We've got hydraulic fluid streaks along the belly," Rodriguez called out to his team. "I can see some minor skin damage on the left wing, and there are definite stress marks around the weapons pylons. This bird took a beating up there." Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, feeling physically and emotionally drained. The intense concentration required during aerial combat, combined with the physical stress of high-G maneuvering, had left her exhausted in a way that was difficult to describe to someone who had never experienced it. Her flight suit was soaked with perspiration, and her hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline that was still working its way out of her system. Rodriguez approached her with a mixture of concern and admiration on his weathered face. As her crew chief, he took personal responsibility for the condition of the aircraft and the safety of the pilot who flew it. Seeing his aircraft return with battle damage was both troubling and gratifying. Troubling because it meant systems had been stressed beyond their normal limits, but gratifying because it meant his pilot had survived a dangerous engagement. "Captain Chun, how did she handle up there?" Rodriguez asked, referring to the aircraft as he would a living being. Like many experienced maintenance personnel, he had developed an almost personal relationship with the machines he cared for. "She saved my life, Chief," Sarah replied honestly. The hydraulic system started acting up about halfway through the engagement, but it held together long enough to get me home. "Without your prep work this morning, I might not be standing here." Rodriguez nodded with satisfaction. He had worked on military aircraft for long enough to understand the direct connection between maintenance quality and pilot survival. Every bolt he tightened, every system he tested, every component he replaced was potentially the difference between life and death for the pilots who depended on his work. "We'll have her back in fighting condition within 48 hours, Rodriguez promised. "But first, we need to conduct a complete inspection to assess all the damage." Some of these stress marks suggest the aircraft exceeded design limits during your maneuvering. Sarah wasn't surprised by this assessment. The violent evasive maneuvers required to avoid enemy missiles had subjected the aircraft to G-forces that were at the very edge of its structural capabilities. Modern fighter aircraft were built to withstand incredible stress, but they were not indestructible, and every system had its limits. As the maintenance team began their detailed inspection of the aircraft, Sarah was met by Colonel Martinez, her squadron commander. Martinez was a veteran pilot himself, with over 20 years of experience in fighter aircraft and multiple combat deployments. He had been monitoring the engagement from the Squadron Operations Center and wanted to debrief Sarah while the details were still fresh in her memory. "Outstanding work out there, Captain," Martinez said as he approached. 7 confirmed kills in a single engagement is something that'll be talked about for years. But right now, I need to know how you're doing personally. That was an intense fight, and I want to make sure you're processing it properly. Sarah appreciated her commander's concern for her psychological well-being. Combat stress was a serious issue in military aviation, and pilots who had been through intense engagements sometimes struggled with the emotional aftermath. The military had learned through hard experience that even successful missions could have lasting psychological effects on personnel. "I'm doing well, sir," Sarah replied. "Tired, obviously, but I feel good about how everything went." The convoy completed their mission safely, and that's what matters most to me. Martinez studied her carefully, looking for signs of stress or emotional problems that might not be immediately apparent. As a commander, he had seen pilots who appeared fine immediately after combat, but later developed serious issues as the full impact of their experiences sank in. He made a mental note to check on Sarah's condition over the next few days and to ensure she had access to counseling services if needed. "We'll conduct a full tactical debrief this afternoon," Martinez continued. "But first, I want you to get some rest and something to eat. You've been flying for almost 4 hours, most of it under combat conditions. Your body and mine need time to recover." As Sarah walked toward the squadron building, she was intercepted by Captain Morrison, who had returned to base with his convoy shortly after she had landed. Morrison looked like a man who had been through his own intense experience, with dust covering his uniform and fatigue evident in his eyes. However, he was clearly determined to speak with Sarah before attending to his own post-mission requirements. "Captain Shun, I had to catch you before you disappeared into debriefings and paperwork," Morrison said. "What you did up there today was nothing short of miraculous. My entire team owes you their lives, and I wanted to make sure you knew how grateful we are." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise, as she often did when people thanked her for what she considered to be simply doing her job. "I'm just glad everyone made it home safely, Captain. How did the supply delivery go?" "Perfectly," Morrison replied with enthusiasm. "The villagers were incredibly grateful for the supplies. The medical equipment we brought will literally save lives, and the water purification systems will prevent disease outbreaks that could have killed dozens of people. None of that would have been possible without your protection." The conversation with Morrison helped reinforce for Sarah why she had chosen military service. While the aerial combat had been intense and dangerous, the ultimate purpose of the mission was to help people who desperately needed assistance. The successful delivery of humanitarian supplies to a remote village might not make headlines, but it represented the kind of positive impact that military forces could have when properly employed. After Morrison departed to begin his own post-mission procedures, Sarah finally made it to the squadron building. The operations center was buzzing with activity as personnel processed the intelligence gathered during the morning's engagement. Analysts were reviewing radar data, communications intercepts, and pilot reports to build a complete picture of the enemy capabilities and tactics that had been encountered. Sarah was directed to a quiet room where she could begin the process of documenting her experiences during the engagement. Military protocol required detailed written reports from all participants in combat operations, both for historical records and to capture lessons learned that could benefit future missions. The process was time-consuming, but important for the continuous improvement of tactics and procedures. As Sarah began writing her report, she realized how difficult it was to capture in words the intensity and complexity of aerial combat. The split-second decisions, the constant maneuvering, the precise timing required for weapons employment, all of these elements were difficult to convey in a written document. She did her best to provide accurate details, while also noting the factors that had contributed to her success. The technical capabilities of her aircraft had certainly been important, but Sarah recognized that training and experience had been equally critical. The countless hours of flight training, the repetitive practice of combat procedures, and the simulation exercises that she had sometimes found tedious had all contributed to her ability to function effectively under extreme stress. During a break in her report writing, Sarah received a secure phone call from her parents back in Ohio. News of the engagement had already reached the United States through military channels, and her father, with his background in aviation, understood better than most what his daughter had just accomplished. Her mother, while less familiar with the technical aspects of air combat, recognized the significance of the achievement through the reaction of others. "We're so proud of you, honey," her mother said through the encrypted connection. "The Air Force called to let us know you were safe before we saw anything on the news. Are you really okay?" Sarah smiled at her mother's concern. Despite being thousands of miles away, her parents' support and love remained a source of strength and motivation. "I'm fine, Mom. It was intense, but my training prepared me for it. The important thing is that everyone came home safely." Her father took over the conversation with questions that reflected his own aviation background. 7 kills in one engagement is extraordinary, Sarah. What was the key factor that allowed you to achieve that kind of success against those odds? "Training and teamwork, Dad," Sarah replied. "My aircraft was perfectly maintained, my weapon systems worked flawlessly, and the ground controllers provided excellent support. Plus, I had backup aircraft standing by in case things went wrong. It wasn't just me up there, it was the entire team." The conversation with her parents helped Sarah maintain perspective on her achievement. While others might focus on the individual combat success, she understood that military operations were always team efforts that depended on many people performing their roles effectively. Her success in the air had been enabled by the work of maintenance personnel, weapons technicians, intelligence analysts, air traffic controllers, and numerous other specialists. After completing her initial report and phone call home, Sarah finally had an opportunity to get some rest. She walked to her quarters in the temporary housing area of the base, a simple but functional room that contained everything she needed for her deployment. The contrast between the sparse military accommodation and the high-technology fighter aircraft she had been flying that morning was stark, but didn't bother her. She had long ago learned to find comfort in the simple necessities rather than luxury amenities. Before lying down to rest, Sarah looked out her small window at the flight line, where maintenance crews were still working on her aircraft. She could see Rodriguez and his team carefully examining every component, documenting the damage, and planning the repairs that would be needed to return the F-16 to full operational status. Their dedication and professionalism were representative of the thousands of support personnel who made fighter operations possible. As Sarah finally allowed herself to relax, she reflected on the events of the morning and their broader implications. The successful defense of the convoy had demonstrated the effectiveness of coalition air power, but it had also likely prompted enemy forces to reassess their own capabilities and tactics. Future missions would probably face increased threats as the enemy adapted to the new tactical situation. Sarah also knew that her own role in the squadron would probably change as a result of the morning's success. Young pilots would want to learn from her experience. Commanders would seek her input on tactical procedures, and she would likely be assigned to more challenging and important missions. With success in military aviation came increased responsibility and higher expectations. Despite these future challenges, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she settled down to rest. She had performed her duty effectively under the most challenging circumstances imaginable, and she had contributed to the success of an important humanitarian mission. The skills and training that had been developed over years of preparation had proven their worth when tested in actual combat. Most importantly, from her perspective, everyone had come home safely. Captain Morrison and his convoy personnel were alive, and, well, the villagers had received their desperately needed supplies, and she had landed her damaged aircraft without further incident. In the dangerous world of military aviation, that represented the highest possible measure of success. 3 hours later, Sarah was awakened by a gentle knock on her door. She had managed to get some much-needed rest, though her sleep had been filled with vivid dreams of aerial combat and the persistent sound of missile warning tones. This was not uncommon for pilots who had experienced intense combat. The mind often continued processing the stress and adrenaline long after the actual engagement had ended. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, the squadron's intelligence officer, was waiting outside her door with a tablet computer and a concerned expression. Davis was responsible for analyzing enemy capabilities and tactics, and he needed Sarah's detailed observations to update intelligence assessments for future missions. The information she could provide would be crucial for protecting other pilots who might face similar threats. Captain Shun, I apologize for disturbing your rest, but we've received some intelligence that requires your immediate input, Davis said as Sarah invited him into her quarters. The enemy forces have been very active since your engagement this morning, and we're seeing tactical changes that suggest they're adapting to what happened. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed and accepted the tablet that Davis offered. The screen displayed a map of the region with various colored symbols indicating friendly and enemy positions. Red symbols showed locations where enemy aircraft had been detected, and there were far more of them than Sarah had seen in previous intelligence briefings. They've moved significant air assets into the area, Davis continued. We're tracking at least 20 additional fighter aircraft that weren't here yesterday. Intelligence suggests they're planning some kind of retaliation for the losses they suffered this morning. The prospect of facing even more enemy fighters was daunting, but Sarah understood that her success had likely provoked exactly this kind of response. Enemy commanders would need to demonstrate that they could still operate effectively despite their losses, and they would want to avenge the pilots who had been shot down. What kind of aircraft are we looking at? Sarah asked, studying the intelligence data on the tablet screen. Mixed force of older generation fighters, similar to what you encountered this morning, but with some newer aircraft that we haven't seen in this area before. Some of them appear to be equipped with more advanced radar and missile systems than the ones you fought. Sarah absorbed this information while considering its tactical implications. Fighting more sophisticated enemy aircraft would require different tactics and would pose greater risks to coalition pilots. The technological advantage that had helped her succeed in the morning's engagement might be reduced against more modern enemy fighters. There's something else, Davis continued. Communications intercepts suggest that the enemy is specifically targeting coalition humanitarian missions. They apparently view these operations as high-value targets that can generate significant propaganda value if attacked successfully. This news troubled Sarah more than the prospect of facing additional enemy fighters. Military personnel understood and accepted the risks of combat, but targeting humanitarian missions represented an escalation that threatened innocent civilians. The supplies that convoys like Morrison's carried were literally matters of life and death for the people who received them. Are we changing our operational procedures in response to these threats? Sarah asked. That's being discussed at higher levels, but for now, humanitarian missions will continue with enhanced air support. Instead of single aircraft coverage, we'll be using multiple fighter patrols and maintaining quick reaction forces that can respond rapidly to any threats. Sarah nodded her understanding. The increased security measures would reduce the risks to humanitarian convoys, but they would also require more aircraft and personnel. Resources were always limited in military operations, and increased protection for humanitarian missions would mean fewer assets available for other important tasks. After Davis departed with the intelligence information he needed, Sarah prepared for the formal tactical debrief that would analyze every aspect of the morning's engagement. These sessions were critical for identifying lessons learned that could improve tactics and procedures for future missions. Every decision, every maneuver, and every weapons employment would be examined in detail. The debrief was conducted in a secure conference room with participation from squadron pilots, intelligence personnel, and representatives from higher command levels. Colonel Martinez presided over the session, which began with a detailed review of radar data that showed the entire engagement from multiple perspectives. Watching the engagement played back on large screens was both fascinating and somewhat unsettling for Sarah, as she could see how close she had come to being shot down on several occasions. The enemy tactics showed good coordination initially, observed Major Thompson, the squadron's weapons officer. They attempted to overwhelm you with multiple simultaneous attacks from different directions. What was your assessment of their skill level? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. The individual pilots showed varying skill levels. Some of them were clearly experienced and flew tactically sound intercepts. Others made basic errors that suggested less training or experience. The biggest advantage I had was superior technology and weapons systems. Your missile employment was textbook perfect, Thompson continued. You achieved kills at both long and short range, and you successfully adapted your tactics as the engagement progressed. The long-range shots with the AMRAAM missiles were particularly effective in reducing the numerical odds before the enemy could close to short-range combat. The debrief continued for over 2 hours, with detailed analysis of every aspect of the engagement. Participants discussed alternative tactics that might have been employed, identified areas where procedures could be improved, and captured lessons learned that would be shared with other squadrons facing similar threats. The process was thorough and sometimes repetitive, but it was essential for the continuous improvement of combat effectiveness. One significant finding from the debrief was the importance of maintaining aircraft in peak condition. Sarah's F-16 had performed superbly throughout the engagement, but the stress of extreme maneuvering had pushed several systems to their limits. Maintenance crews would need to conduct more frequent and detailed inspections of aircraft that had been involved in high-intensity combat operations. Another key lesson was the value of realistic training scenarios. The simulation exercises that Sarah had practiced countless times had prepared her well for the actual combat engagement. However, the debrief identified some aspects of the real engagement that were not adequately covered in existing training programs, leading to recommendations for enhanced simulator scenarios. As the formal debrief concluded, Sarah was approached by Captain Sullivan, who had served as her escort during the return flight to base. Sullivan was an experienced pilot who had flown numerous combat missions, but he had never been involved in an engagement with multiple enemy aircraft. He wanted to understand how Sarah had managed the stress and complexity of fighting 7 opponents simultaneously. The thing that impressed me most was how calm you sounded on the radio throughout the entire fight, Sullivan said. I've been in some intense situations, but nothing like what you went through this morning. How do you stay focused when everything is happening so fast? Sarah smiled at the question, recognizing that Sullivan was seeking practical advice that could help him in future combat situations. The training really does prepare you for it, she replied. All those hours of practice and simulation exercises create muscle memory that takes over when you don't have time to think through every decision. Trust your training, trust your aircraft, and stay aggressive. Did you ever feel overwhelmed by the number of enemy fighters? Sullivan asked. For a few seconds early in the fight, yes, Sarah admitted honestly. 7 against 1 is not good odds by any calculation. But once I started reducing their numbers and disrupting their coordination, the situation became more manageable. The key was preventing them from attacking me all at once. Their conversation was interrupted by Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who approached with an update on the condition of Sarah's aircraft. The maintenance inspection had revealed more extensive damage than initially apparent, but nothing that couldn't be repaired with the resources available at Bagram Air Base. The hydraulic system needs to be completely replaced, Rodriguez reported. We also found stress fractures in 2 wing components and damage to the radar warning receiver. The repairs will take about 36 hours, but she'll be better than new when we're finished. Sarah thanked Rodriguez for his thorough work and attention to detail. The fact that her aircraft had survived the engagement with only moderate damage was a testament to both the quality of its construction and the skill of the maintenance personnel who kept it in optimal condition. She made a mental note to commend Rodriguez and his team in her formal report. As the day progressed, word of Sarah's combat success spread throughout the base and beyond. Fighter pilots from other squadrons stopped by to congratulate her and ask about her experiences. Ground personnel who had heard about the engagement approached her with expressions of admiration and respect. The attention was flattering, but also somewhat uncomfortable for Sarah, who preferred to focus on the team aspects of military operations rather than individual achievements. The most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. As Sarah was walking to the dining facility for dinner, she encountered a group of personnel from Morrison's convoy who had returned to base after completing their supply delivery mission. These soldiers, who had been on the receiving end of her protection that morning, wanted to express their gratitude in person. Captain Shun, we wanted to thank you again for what you did today, said Sergeant Martinez, one of Morrison's vehicle commanders. We all have families back home, and we wouldn't be able to see them again if it wasn't for your flying. There aren't words to express how grateful we are. The sincere appreciation from the ground personnel reminded Sarah of the human dimension of military operations. Behind all the technology, tactics, and procedures were real people with families, hopes, and dreams. Her success in the morning's engagement had ensured that these people would return home safely to their loved ones, and that made all the risks and stress worthwhile. That evening, Sarah received a secure video call from General Patterson, the regional air commander who oversaw all coalition air operations in Afghanistan. General Patterson was a legendary figure in fighter aviation, with a distinguished career that included combat experience in multiple conflicts. Having him take personal time to speak with a young captain was both an honor and an indication of the significance of the morning's engagement. Captain Shun, I wanted to personally congratulate you on today's remarkable achievement, General Patterson said through the encrypted video connection. 7 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single engagement is extraordinary by any measure. Your actions today have significantly degraded enemy air capabilities in the region. Sarah felt both pride and humility at the recognition from such a senior officer. Thank you, sir. I was fortunate to have excellent aircraft, superior weapon systems, and outstanding support from ground personnel. Your modesty is commendable, Captain, but don't underestimate the skill and courage you displayed under extremely challenging circumstances. The tactical decisions you made during that engagement will be studied and taught for years to come. General Patterson went on to inform Sarah that her combat success was being reviewed for possible recognition through military awards and commendations. While she appreciated the prospect of formal recognition, Sarah was more interested in the general's assessment of the broader tactical situation and how her engagement fit into the overall mission in Afghanistan. The enemy has definitely taken notice of what happened today, General Patterson explained. We're seeing increased activity across the entire region as they attempt to respond to their losses. Your success has provided us with valuable intelligence about their capabilities and tactics, but it has also prompted them to escalate their own operations. As the video call concluded, Sarah reflected on the complex nature of military success. Her victory in the morning's engagement had achieved its immediate objectives, protecting the convoy and eliminating enemy threats, but it had also created new challenges and risks. This was the nature of warfare, where every action produced reactions that required constant adaptation and response. Looking out at the flight line, where her damaged aircraft sat, surrounded by maintenance equipment and personnel, Sarah felt a deep sense of connection to the entire military community. From the pilots who flew the missions to the mechanics who maintained the aircraft to the ground controllers who provided support, everyone played a crucial role in achieving mission success. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new missions, but tonight Sarah could take satisfaction in knowing that she had performed her duty with skill, courage, and honor. The humanitarian supplies had been delivered, the convoy personnel had returned safely, and enemy capabilities had been significantly reduced. In the dangerous and complex world of military aviation that represented the highest possible achievement,